All right, Bret, let's find out how we rank the top 10 exercises for glute growth according to ChatGPT on a tier list. You ready?
I'm ready.
Let's do it. Bret, you'll take a hypertrophy lens and you'll have your own tier list. I'm going to take more of a mobility and functional standpoint with these tier rankings. And so we'll just go one and then back to me, and then we'll go through the whole list through all 20. Banded squats with a heavy resistance, band above the knees.
Interestingly, the research shows that this does increase glute activity, but they didn't specify what. Are you loading it at the, are you doing goblets? Are you doing back squats with that? Or is it just the only resistance is with the band?
Yeah, let's just say it's like a regular high bar back squat with a band around the knees.
Okay, so interesting. I think you've made videos about this, but I beg to differ. The only study on this is the Kennedy. Well, Kennedy did a study on hip thrust and glute bridges, but he showed increased upper glute max activity with lighter loads.
Why do you think that is?
Interestingly, he found lower glute medius activity on the hip thrust. So at the top of the hip thrust, you think you're pushing out using the glute medius, but I think throughout the range, pushing out just causes you to, so people would argue and say like, oh, it's artificial. No, resistance is resistance. If you can combine two rolls and you have, because you look at the glutes, they're a diagonal muscle, especially when you're deep hip flexion. I just posted something yesterday. In deep hip flexion, that low glute max looks like it'd be well suited for abduction. But anyway, I think it's a good idea if you're trying to limit, it could possibly theoretically reduce adductor recruitment. That's an easy EMG study to do, but it hasn't been done yet. But anyway, if you're pushing out, there's been one theory that you're gonna limit the load you can use, and that's true. Studies show you use about 10% less loading when you put a band around the knees. On squats, a couple studies have shown it doesn't reduce loading. You're like, how can that be? Even with trained subjects, how could you possibly? But I think there's a difference between doing with squats and hip thrusts. When you do them with squats, you need like a large band. You're kind of doing them with the thought of like, don't let your knees cave in. Try to keep, you're not pushing maximally with them. So the studies on squats show that it increases glute activation, including glute medius too. Glute medius and glute max, I don't think no studies looked at upper versus lower glute max. And then the other study on the hip thrust and glute bridges showed increased glute medius activity. I almost think in one of them you got a little bit decreased glute medius activity, which is crazy, but it did increase upper glute max activity. So I think it's a good idea because it does limit your loading with the same muscle activation, the same stretch. So I like it, but I don't think this should be like a primary consideration for you. Like I said, my girls, I'll say if you hip thrust 3 times a week, you can wear bands around your knees 1 time. If you have a lot of pain at your hips from the barbell, then wear the band because you'll have less load every 10%, especially if you're hip thrusting 500 pounds, 10% of 500 is 50 pounds. You can use 50 less pounds, every little bit matters. And if you're someone who does not want adductor growth, we might find in time that it limits adductor growth or maybe not, but I'm not a band hater like a lot of people are. So I don't want it interfering with progressive overload, but I do think it's a good strategy, especially with these ladies who train glutes 3 times a week. You have room for variety. Don't be afraid to use the band, but I'm just gonna put it as like C tier. Okay. I'm gonna put the squat higher, but I'm gonna put that as C tier because it can distract you.
Okay, so here's a question I have for
just
you.
because you don't see jack dudes putting bands around their knees during squats.
Exactly.
You see people who are afraid to use weight. It like distracts you from progressive overload. That's why I'm putting it C tier.
So it's so interesting the idea of like the band around the knees, because in theory, if you want a muscle to be able to properly contract, it needs to come from a position of relative length, right? So walk me through the biomechanics of like, if you're going down to the bottom of a hip thrust and you're pushing your knees out, am I understanding that correctly? Like you're pushing your knees out against the resistance of the band at the bottom.
I don't think it changes.
Do you think that is going to create an inability to get the length through the backside of the pelvis that would be necessary to go up?
So
What do you think is happening there?
So this is such a good question because, yeah, let's say you get down to the bottom of a squat or a hip thrust, and you'd normally be here, but now you're out here, then you just reduce the stretch. So you have to wear a band that's just the right length and tension to not allow you to go way out wider. You can wear a band that keeps you at that same position, but now you're getting the same exact stretch, you're in the same femur position, but now you're simply applying resistance in two ways. You're loading up abduction and hip extension without interfering with the mechanics, but that's hard to do.
No, I like that. I think this is why it's so cool of like our two different perspectives here, because from my perspective, like it very much depends on like, is that band allowing your knees to stay in line with your toes? Because that could be very helpful, in my opinion. That could be a good teaching tool because, you know, as you go down into a squat, again, what I'm looking for is this alternation and this change between as we move into hip flexion, the knees go over the toes. That allows for the bones to internally rotate, turn in, which allows the foot to pronate, which is necessary for the knees to go over the toes. And if the band allows you to do that without collapsing your knees, you'll still get the length through the glutes. You'll still get all those good motions of the bones. That can be awesome. But what I am fearful of is when you go down and you're shoving out against the resistance of the band, now all of a sudden your weight and your center of gravity gets shoved to the outside of your feet. You're limiting that ability for your feet to pronate. You're limiting your ability to get the internal rotation of the bones. And for me, like that is not necessarily ideal from a strict movement, range of motion, mobility perspective. So it depends, like, you know, they're not clear about it in ChatGPT of like, which one is it?
Well, no one's defined it.
Yeah, but that's so cool. That's so cool to see like how your perspective of the band, it can be helpful from my perspective.
But if you wanted that internal rotation and the knees to be either over the, or even if you wanted a little varus to give you more stretch on the glute, you could just use a really tight band and know you're going to go into some varus, because a recent study showed with musculoskeletal modeling that knees in had a higher glute loading than knees out. And but you could still use that cheat code. Wear a smaller band, but then a lot of people, like if I go knees too close together, I can't. It throws off my whole, it hurts my knees. I need to get my knees out for me to get depth. So this is a very nuanced topic, but yeah, you could theoretically.
I think the reason why knees oftentimes hurt when people go in on these exercises, especially like squats, is because like people don't have that genuine internal rotation. Like people shove their knees out because a lot of people have, generally speaking, more space to move out and shove their knees out into like an ER space, external rotation space, than they do the internal rotation space. That's why it generally feels better, is because a lot of people suck at internal rotation, pronation being genuinely paired together. But if you go out like this, then from a hypertrophy standpoint, I would default to you and what you would probably believe is best. But from my perspective, they're doing that to avoid what they can't do very well. And maybe, let's say like bigger guys like you, like if you did have the internal rotation space, I wonder if you ran a study, like would it be better for you to allow your knees to go in, or versus like staying what's comfortable and going knees out? I wonder, I don't know.
Well, because we think of the stretch as mainly being how deep you go. But how abducted and extra rotated you also
That's
affects
a whole
the
nother
stretch.
layer. Yeah.
And it significantly increases the stretch. So yeah, we need studies. So this is why we offer our opinions, because in the absence of experiments, we have to go by biomechanical logic.
Absolutely.
And you're thinking more from like a healthy, functional perspective. I'm thinking of just pure glute growth, but that's why these
It's awesome. It's a great discussion. So for me personally, and again, it just depends on where you're, because I'm going to assume like we're talking about the squat where they're pushing the knees out. For me, that's going to be in the D tier for the reasons that I listed. So I'm being really negative right now. I have a lot in the D and F tier. All right. Next one we got is a landmine reverse lunge.
I mean, theoretically, the landmine can make it, if you load it from the floor, it's kind of like, it's a longer lever at the very bottom, and as you come up, you can
Are you imagining this is like we're holding it off to the side
Yeah,
and
it
we're
depends
going
how
down?
you hold it
Yeah,
off.
it depends
if
how
you
you
do
hold
like
it.
kind of rotationally or just straight to the
Let's
side.
do it with like the rotational component.
Yeah, my friend Ben Bruno loves these, and I had a friend Nick Tumino like these too. So it's like I just never got into using the landmine too much. Personally, being tall, I never liked the landmine because I'm like I feel so much at the bottom and nothing at the top. And then as time went on, we got a lot of research. Maybe I should have cared more about the bottom, but it's also the reason why I never got excited about it is it's hard to grip. It's a thick bar.
Very
So I
challenging.
just never. I don't want to use a strap. And I don't want to be limited by loading. So I love all resistance. I love exercises. I've never made landmines a huge component of my training, but I have 2 friends who did, and they love it. And so I'm not an exercise hater. I just would say, why the landmine? Just use a dumbbell or use a Smith machine or just
Completely agree.
be contralateral braced, because with the landmine, you usually don't brace yourself. You're usually kind of like this arm's out here or on your hip, and so it's a little bit unstable. So I'm going to say C tier for those reasons.
Okay. Landmine reverse lunge. So, with a reverse lunge, for a lot of people, it is kind of easier to move backwards than it is forwards. So I think strictly from an ease of execution standpoint, I think that a reverse lunge is nice. I do think the grip is a problem, though. I agree with you. So if they said, let's say a kickstand, dumbbell, single leg reverse lunge, like that could be really nice. I think that could be great. But because they're using a landmine, that's kind of like going to inherently limit your capabilities of executing the movement properly. However, because there is that rotational component, I'm a huge fan of that.
Yeah.
Because you're going to be able to drive the ability, which a lot of people don't have a great genuine capability and capacity to internally rotate, turn into one side. For me, the name of the game, as I'm touching on it, is all about your ability to effectively like shift from side to side, be able to effectively move through like the gait and running cycle. People that do that generally feel pretty good on a day-to-day basis. It's just that sometimes weight training can interfere with your ability to do that, depending on how you do it, for how long, how strong, how big you are. But if you can get some exercises in there that supplement your ability to create rotation into one side. Not only does that drive great length through the glute, but it also is going to drive the associated joint actions that are paired with the rotation and paired with the ability to genuinely properly shift into that side. And so I'm a fan, generally speaking, of single leg lunges or hinges that drive rotation and you keep your back leg on the ground. I'm a big fan of that. Like if you imagine a hip airplane, for example, has a similar component to it, right? But the back leg is off the ground. You're losing external stability. So you're more likely to compensate through your low back. But with this,
But
I
you
like
could do this with this is getting popular now. Just use a dumbbell and rotate.
100%.
The landmine forces you to rotate a little bit, so it's
Which does have a nice component.
Right, I agree.
So for me, I'm going to put this in the A tier because I do like a lot of the carryover that it has, and it fills in the gaps that a lot of people are missing. Sled push, but heavy.
heavy sled pushes. It's funny, I have a track and field researcher friend who said that they actually can get, because it's funny, sled pushing is also purely concentric. There's no eccentric component.
Yep.
And therefore you can do more volume. It doesn't create much muscle damage. But he's saying he's getting a lot, they published a study that a lot of soreness, the participants were getting a ton of soreness because it was so heavy and so hard in that stretch position. But yeah, I think you could do heavy sled pushes, for example, 3 times a week. But the progressive overload is kind of tough. You change your form a little bit. It's not it's not a resistance exercise with eccentric and concentric component. And to use progressive overload, you need to perform it in the same place every time, because if you have a different sled, are you pushing on AstroTurf, are you taking outside, there's different friction coefficients. Yeah. And so, yeah, it's just not, I think it could build glutes well if that's all you did, and you could do them more upright, you could do them leaning forward, you could do pushes and drags, but I'm going to say C tier just because it's harder to standardize in progressive overload.
Yeah, for that reason, like if you're looking to improve your mobility, how you feel, how you move, then generally speaking, like you want to have both ends of the spectrum of moving into a position and then getting like a stretch in an exercise, or just like moving into a lengthened position and then coming out of it again. And you want your muscles to control those relative bone movements, right? And so with a sled push, for a lot of reasons you said, like you're not getting as much of that eccentric component, but I am a fan of the fact that you are doing something that is creating a little bit of rotation, side to side movement in the transverse plane, so to speak, not as much as like the frontal. But because you are holding on to something and because you are straight up pushing forward, you aren't getting the rotation as much through here. You're getting it mostly just through your lower body. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that, but it just goes into this concept of like so many exercises in the gym are just so biased towards like locking you into a position and not giving you a lot of freedom of rotation and movement. And that's sometimes necessary from a hypertrophy standpoint. But if you're looking at it from like, do you want to just have more fluid movement, more range of motion? Do you want things to not be really locked up? The heavy sled push is just going to be more on that end of the spectrum. So for me, I do think that there are pros to it, but the lack of the eccentric component and the fact that you are just locking up your upper body and holding it in place, and you're not really like driving through your foot all the way from heel to toes. Mostly you're just gonna be shoving your center of gravity forward over your foot. I'm not the biggest fan of this, and I also think that in just terms of the ability to overload it, you're gonna reach like a certain plateau, but that is from a hypertrophy standpoint. So for me, I'm gonna put this in the F tier. I actually don't like this exercise very much at all. All right, let's go to the next one. Glute focused 45-degree back extensions.
Okay, we're at 14. I love glute focused 45 hypers. I came up with them back in the day, and it was like this weird thing. I'm like, why are me and my clients rounding their backs? I'm gonna get crucified by the strength coaches who will tell people they're gonna get stuck in this posture if they do one set of this. And I knew I was. They were like, what is Bret doing now? But I didn't think of it. I said, why am I doing this? Why is my client Carly doing this? Her mom filmed the first video. She filmed it while I was training her on YouTube of the rounded back 45-degree hyper. But
so just to be clear, you're on a 45 hyper and you are rounded, flexed through the spine, and you're driving the hip extension through the glutes, trying to keep the back out of it.
And the back and the feet are flared.
Okay.
And the cues are hump the pad, drive your hips into the pad, don't let your spine unravel. That is very hard for some people to. This is one of the hardest lifts to teach for people who don't get it right away. So it's kind of like with like hinging. For some people, it is such a hard lift to teach, and I end up just lying to them and being, "You're looking good," because I don't want to frustrate them. And then it takes me like, it's taken me a couple months on some clients, but there's clients that get it right away. You go round over, round, 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 tuck your chin, round over. Okay, now I want you swiveling through the hips, spin through your hips, come up and don't unravel, and some of them get it right away. A lot of times you'll have people go, oh my God, this is the first time I feel like my glutes went to failure.
I know what you mean.
Instead of my low back. But I also like hinge. I like all variations.
The hinge is great too, because you do get that like co-contraction from the spinal erectors, and like that can be helpful for getting more glutes involved to a certain extent.
And you could say it's a more functional movement because you're using it all the posture changing. Keep the feet straight. So we do neutral, neutral. I like the rounded back because when you lock out, when you're rounded and you lock out at the top of a 45-degree hyper, you're pretty much straight out. The rounded makes you like straight out, and that increases the moment arm. So it makes it more of a lockout movement. Yes, you're at the bottom when you're rounded. You don't get quite the stretch. You're not an anterior tilt. You're not going to stretch
as much stretch.
But we're not doing it for. If I wanted the stretch, I'd do a Romanian or a stiff leg or a good morning, or a single leg RDL. So I want this for the squeeze. So I'm going to round, because why would you not want to take your erectors out of it to some degree? Focus on the glutes. Turn the feet out. It works more lateral hamstring, but more glutes too. And because you're focusing on the squeeze, make it a squeeze position movement. You could, but I also like neutral. But I do like one thing that when I was measuring EMG activation of the glutes, I consistently saw that these get you like at high as peaks as hip thrusts do. Hip thrusts got all the attention. These drive muscle activation through the roof, but they never took off in popularity quite as much. But for people who hate hip thrusts, you need to do something that works the squeeze position. So you're left at kickbacks and 45s. I'd rather you do 45s this way to work that squeeze position, because kickbacks, you're never like squeezing maximally, like grinding out a kickback and getting that big squeeze. So I think these are I'm going to put these at B tier. They're underrated. I love them.
I like that.
Yeah.
I like that. 45-degree. You know, I think you're the first person I've met that's like, you know, big on social media that loves these as much as I do, because, you know, you're exactly right. Like, yes, if you're doing it, and let's say we're doing it with the flex back, because I think that would be more of the sort of like exercise that we're talking about the most right now. So yes, you could be in an anterior tilt and you can get the stretch through the glutes, all that stuff. But if we just set that aside for a second and think about what you're doing if you keep more of a rounded back, well, you're taking the person's risk of just extending through their spine out of it, and you're forcing them to use their glutes. Now, most people won't be able to go up as much if they're staying through their genuine end range, but you can also do it in a way where it's like that cue of, I like that hump. I also like something that's really helpful is like try to drive your back pockets to the back of your knees. That's another cue that I found to be very helpful. That is so helpful because people don't know what it means, like to genuinely.
That's your pelvic tilting. And I'm not rotating through the spine. I'm keeping the spine locked and I'm rotating through the pelvis. And I think that's a very good strategy for lifting heavy loads off the ground, because a lot of people are round backers.
Yep.
And yes, you should teach them how to hinge with a neutral posture, but you also should prepare for the inevitability of, if you're way stronger like me at rounding, you're going to do it. You might as well teach them how to use their glutes to round.
Absolutely.
And kind of not. Yeah, so I totally
I think that's the problem with flexion.
That back pocket to your knees is a great cue. I never thought of that.
I think people are afraid of flexion because they're not good at flexion. It's not that flexion is bad. It's just that people suck at moving into it. So I do think like there's real value there.
It's also such a scary injury. Like,
it is terrifying.
So we need to care more, because you've got your spinal cord in there. You don't want to, you don't want too much.
Inherently, it is scary, but I think that there's really no necessarily like bad movements, just movements the body isn't prepared for necessarily.
Totally agree.
But just to wrap up my thoughts on the back extension, if you want to get a little bit more length of the glutes, then yeah, you can add a little bit of anterior tilt as you're going down. Like there is a world in which you don't have to like be completely flexed or completely extended, but let's just say you are just being more flexed. There are very few things I've done with people that will allow them to genuinely feel that extension through their glutes without their low back being involved. And it is like such a beautiful exercise for getting people to feel that in the right way. So for me, not only will it help you do that really effectively, but like you can use it to improve hip extension over time. There is a foot component, which isn't as specific to like how we move as, you know, other things maybe, but like who cares, you know? Like not everything needs to be hyper specific. And I do think that there's a lot of value in this exercise. So for me, I'm going to put this in the A tier.
And I like how you said you don't have to be full flexion if you don't want. You can be mostly thoracic flexion if you wanted. You can be, you know.
Yeah, you can find what works for you, and some people need more extension.
Anterior pelvic tilt on the way down, posterior pelvic tilt on the way up.
Yep, that's nice. Frog pumps.
So frog pumps, I would say is the exercise I feel more than any other glute exercise. I walk with my feet out. I have a family of like, you know, we walk like ducks.
Duck walkers, yeah.
A family of duck walkers. Yeah. And I think it just naturally suits my hips well. In fact, a lot of exercise that like that kneeling glute isolator I told you about, I tend to want to put my feet closer and spread my knees out, and that's the way I get the best squeeze. Some people think, oh, you're externally rotated, that's going to work upper glutes. No, it works the lower glutes well too. When you move look at the fibers of the glutes. They are not, if it was just meant for vertical, it'd be like a hamstring, you know? The glute fibers connect from basically here to here. And so when you move the femur out and external rotate a little bit, because now you're making it almost like that motion is now more in line, you improve their moment arm a little bit possibly, and you improve the fiber direction more congruent. So I don't think we need to never do sumo. Never do frog pumps, you're abducted and externally rotated. Don't avoid that completely, throw it in. I'm a fan of training the stretch position really well and the squeeze position very well. I love them. I would put them at, I would say, C tier for me, but I have with an asterisk because I have a curiosity. What if they create no damage? What if you did them like 5 days a week? Could it be amazing for glute growth? It might be, we just don't know enough yet.
You know, I think this is the first one where we're gonna like probably differ a little bit in our opinions. You brought up the really interesting point about how like a third of people when you did the frog pumps at the seminar felt nothing, a third felt maybe a little bit, and third felt like it was a crazy contraction. I think there are so many variables that go into why people may or may not feel a certain exercise. And I think some of it is just strictly like your mind-muscle connection, coordination. Others, it's like, do you have the ability to actually like achieve the joint position that is necessary to move into that end range or X amount of range? Because like your muscles, in my opinion, are kind of slaves to your joints position to actually achieve what you're trying to go for. For example, external rotation. If you don't have external rotation space, then how are you going to genuinely get your glutes to move through external rotation and abduction? You know what I mean? Like there will be a point at which you reach your end range and you can no longer go into more of that without significant compensation. Now, whether your glutes are working with that compensation or not is an entirely different story depending on so many different contextual factors. But I think that frog pumps in particular, like they're not getting, because there is so much abduction and external rotation. I see the shortened position argument. I see that, and I think that that's a good point. But for me, like there's not force being applied to the ground. There's not force being applied in a meaningful way, and there's not a good foot reference. It's just the feet being together, and there's not enough length being driven there. It's just because a lot of my clients have this problem. I think this will make a lot of sense to people. We were talking about this before we started filming. A lot of my clients have an issue where there's already a lot of tension through the backside of the pelvis. Like they're either being shoved down under into this position, like a sway back posture, or they're being, you know, anteriorly tilted, but they still have a lot of tension on the backside of the pelvis because this is preventing them from falling too far forward. And so anything that creates a ton of concentric orientation on the backside of the pelvis without allowing for also, on the other end of the spectrum, adequate length, I think is just promoting more of this. And that's just not something my population in particular needs. But that's, again, my specific population. It might be different for other people that are looking for, like you said, there's value in like, hey, I'm sick of doing hip thrusts, just get me on the, let me feel something for a little bit. You know, like that's cool, I get that. So that, for that reason, I'm probably gonna put them in the D tier, but I understand the argument for the other side of the equation. All right, let's go to the next one. All right, next one, we got sumo deadlift.
So I think the sumo deadlift is a good glute builder. It gets so much hate these days. But what I will say, it's kind of like, all right, squats and hip thrusts tied for glute growth. Squats stretch you more and are harder in the stretch position. Hip thrusts stretch you less and are harder in the squeeze position. But like I said with sumo, when you abduct and you get down, you're taking away some of the stretch. Because you're abducting and externally rotating a little, but you're also lining the fibers up better so that they may activate better. So, interestingly, the studies on deadlift variations don't show greater activation with sumo, but the studies on squats do show greater activation. But anyway, I just think a lot of women love it. They feel their glutes more,
feel it.
And I think it's very functional. I think people don't just. You shouldn't just do narrow stance. If you train at my gym, I want you to learn all the types of squats, all the types of deadlifts. I want you to be a student of the game.
Yep.
You're more likely to lift for life if you understand it better.
The issue I see people get into with sumo deadlifts is that they only sumo deadlift and they don't do anything else, because that, we run into the issue, just like with the frog pumps, that just promotes more of what a lot of people already have, which is an inability to lengthen back here and achieve a genuinely internally rotated position in a position of hip flexion. I saw one study that compared the sumo to the conventional, and I think what it said was that the sumo deadlift, and I'll try to link it if I can find it, the sumo deadlift was more adductors, just like a wider stance leg press would be more adductors versus like a narrow stance, more glutes.
I think it's Escamilla 2001.
That sounds right.
Yeah.
That sounds right, actually. So, can that be helpful? Yeah, like, will a lot of people pick up stuff like just off of the ground and more of a sumo stance versus a conventional stance? I'd say honestly, probably. More people are gonna bias themselves towards more of a wider stance. So I think it can be, just for the purposes of variability, if it's balanced well, it can be fine. But I do think that if you are dealing with a lot of movement limitations and issues, it can predispose people towards a lot of the common problems that are keeping them locked up in a certain pattern or posture. So if there's variability present within a program, I think that they can be just fine. I don't think they're going to necessarily, in terms of improving joint range of motion, do a lot for you, just because when they get so heavy, you're gonna do whatever it takes to get that weight off the ground. You're going to extend, you're going to abduct, you're going to like do whatever it takes for your foot to put force through the ground to stand up. So for that reason, I'm not the biggest fan of them from a functional perspective in terms of feeling better and moving better, but I don't think they're inherently a super, super harmful exercise. So I'm gonna put them in the, somewhere between C and D. I'll be nice and go C tier. And where did you have those?
I don't think I said.
Oh yeah.
I'm gonna go B tier.
B tier. Next, we got step ups on a high step.
Okay, yeah. Huge fan of step ups. Yeah, we do them super high, more upright. For more, yes, it's gonna work glutes and adductors, but more quads. And then we do glute dominant, where you try to just go to parallel and lean a lot and reach back. Obviously control the eccentric phase, try to just tap. I love that you don't have to go crazy with loading when you do it that way. You can do brace with a dumbbell.
Yep,
you can even do
totally.
ankle weight. We have ankle weights at my gym. They like ankle weights the most, and they're holding on. I'm just such a huge fan of step ups. Done, especially glute dominant step ups. I don't even need to say anything more. A tier.
Great exercise. Yep. I also think that these are a great exercise. Let me put this down really quick. I also think they're a great exercise. I think that they can be modified so much to meet the needs of the individual. I think that they just annihilate the glutes when done well. But from my perspective, I think that you can make the range of motion shorter if necessary. I know it indicated high step, but like, what is a high step? You can make that relative to a high step for some people could be a foot off the ground. You know what I mean? If they're
trained older beginners, they started, I think, at like this high.
Yeah, literally, yeah. I've started people with 3 inches.
Got them,
yeah. So it's all relative to the individual, and there's a lot of different ways that you can add like a contralateral load to get more rotation, the stability. The only thing that I think can be a little tricky is simply the fact that there's not maximal stability because the off leg is hovering off of the ground, but like, honestly, so what? You can still modify it to make it really successful. So for me, I'm a pretty big fan of these. For me, it's just secondary to a regular split squat, so I'd put it in the A tier. Bulgarian split squat. Or let's just do split squat in general.
Yeah, I don't do a lot of split squats. I do more Bulgarians, but I love Bulgarians. I'm gonna put them A tier as well, but I actually like lunges and step ups more than Bulgarians and split squats.
Why is that?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I just think about how many exercises they are, and every coach has the ones they prioritize. I think it comes down to, I never liked split squats. I let my rear foot elevated more.
Yeah.
And I just never, but yeah, sometimes you're like, why don't you program this more? And it's like, I think it's my bias. But I just never, I always was like, do a Bulgarian or a lunge, reverse lunge, but I don't do a lot of, I like B stance split squats, but like, I like B stance, like RDLs. But I don't like just static like dumbbell or barbell. I like them off the Smith machine more. I don't know. It's just my bias. I don't even know why. I probably would. Yeah, but it's like, I think maybe if you did a deficit, I'd like them more. I don't know.
Oh, that's
I
nice,
want that parallel thigh position. Some people don't always go. I don't know.
There is value though of like offloading the back leg, so that way you have to get more heavy on the front leg. I think there's a lot of value in that. So I'm gonna put this is an S tier for me, just because I'm kind of going to cheat in my own head and put like split squats under an umbrella. But even if it is just a Bulgarian split squat, it's phenomenal because now you do have that back leg reference. You could even like put your foot up against the wall if you want to be super, super specific, to push into the wall with the back leg with it being supported. So that way you can really push your pelvis forward on that side to really turn into that front leg. I think the loading modifications you can do are phenomenal. I think there's just an endless amount of opportunity with this to drive genuine joint actions because you get the most rotational dissociation between your sides of the pelvis. If you're looking at the actual pelvic innominate bones, which there's not a lot of movement there for sure, but there is some, which can be meaningful. And also the femurs and getting these to alternate and reciprocate, you get the most amount of that when the back leg is flat on the ground against something like a split squat or a Bulgarian split squat with your leg resting against something. That can be helpful because now you can move into internal, external rotation on one side where the back leg remains in hip extension. You just have to be careful that you're not in too much hip extension on that back leg because at that point you're just driving straight up lumbar extension city and you're not going to be getting that full use of your glute in the way that we're looking for. But if you can avoid that, you can do them well. Few things, in my opinion, are going to help people both not only like grow their glutes, but also feel better and move better. Barbell back squat.
I'm going to say A tier, but I kind of think if I had to go with single leg versus double leg for the squat pattern, I'd go with single leg. But I just say A tier because back squats have stood the test of time.
Yep.
I think you can do them in a more glute dominant fashion with a lean, sitting back more with a more vertical shins, just go to parallel. I think the parallel angle, like glute dominant squat, just a parallel leaning forward would grow the glutes better than an upright full squat, but there's no studies on it. But yeah, squats are legendary for growing the glutes. I'm putting them A tier.
Yep.
I just think you have to do, and you can do sumo, you can do convention, you can do narrow, you can do wider, you can do that, but don't neglect your single leg stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so with the barbell back squat, hypertrophy, phenomenal. I think we're running into the same thing in my opinion of the posterior load, the load's behind you like a good morning. That can be a little risky for some people, but if you execute it well, and I'm just gonna assume that's the case, then it's taking you through that full range of motion. It's getting your foot to move through the different shapes needed for it to express all the different movement qualities. I'm generally more of a fan of the front squat because it'll help you keep more of a stacked head over your rib cage, over your pelvis, which generally takes people low back out of it, keeps the core on. But if we're looking at a back squat, the risk is higher. I still like it, not as much as other squats, but I don't think that it is a problem if you have the space, you're moving in the proper amount of space, maybe even adding a heel elevation to help you get deeper into the squat if that's something you're going for. So for me, that is going to be a C tier. Romanian deadlift. I'm going to assume this is a bilateral Romanian deadlift.
Let's just say all of it, yeah. The RDLs, whether it's, we do barbell, we have like all the different plate loaded, like the pit shark, we have the booty builder one, we've got probably 5 different plate loaded deadlift machine. We do RDLs off of all of them. You can do with dumbbells, but the single leg variations, everyone has a favorite. Some like just straight up, braced contralateral or single leg RDLs. Some people like B stance RDLs, which is I guess RDL. Some people for me, I like the single leg abducted, where I have the front out, the leg out to the side and I turn into it. But I think my favorite is hip supported single leg RDL, where I support myself and do one leg at a time. But anyway, they're A tier, legendary, and also just such a staple movement pattern. A tier, amazing. Find the variations you like the most and don't feel the need to do the ones that don't feel good for you.
I like that. That's good advice. For me, it very much depends on how the RDL is being executed. If it's a single leg, can be a big fan of that. B stance, huge fan of that. But when it's a bilateral symmetric stance RDL, especially when the load's heavy, I find that a lot of people, because there's just constant tension on the body as they're doing that. You know, there's no break. If you're RDLing, you are squeezing and you're gonna stay squeezed. And for me, if I want someone to move and feel good, I want them to be able to use their breath appropriately to help decompress and compress the system as necessary. I don't want them in a constant state of tension. So if someone is dealing with a lot of back pain or a lot of movement limitations, this is just going to further create a bias towards them wanting to do the thing that's holding them in the posture and pattern that they're coming in with. And so more isn't necessarily good initially. So from a hypertrophy standpoint, incredible, love it. But from a standpoint of someone that has a lot of tension they're carrying around all the time, not a fan of it. I would not choose it early on in a program, but I do think that there can be a lot of value in hinge variations driving that internal rotation position. So I'm gonna put this in the C tier.
That leaves us with one more exercise.
Can you guess what that is?
The barbell hip thrust.
Go for it, take it away.
I love that ChatGPT put this first.
They knew.
Well, I invented the barbell hip thrust in 2006, and I helped popularize it, but then it got so popular it started getting criticized, especially when this lengthen debate happened. But I will tell you, there's 3 studies. There's the Plotkin 2023, there is Cassiano 2024, and there's Bartholomew 2024. It seems the hip thrusts are right up there with the lengthen movements. You can pretty much ascertain from the literature that they are on par with squats, step ups, leg press, stiff leg deadlifts at growing the glutes. But you can do more volume with hip thrusts. We go really heavy on our hip thrusts, and people do not experience a lot of injuries with them. In my opinion, they're the safest heavy lower body bilateral lift. The safest heavy lower body lift. I've seen more injuries on leg press than I have on hip thrust. I've seen more injuries with single leg, like lunges and stuff, just because they can fall. I've seen, and then squats and deads. So hip thrusts, you can always find a hip thrust variation that you like the most. The only problem is the setup sucks, but now you have more gyms with Smith machines, more gyms with plate loaded devices. Some of them are way better than others. But that's the next phase of the hip thrust, is the enter the machine era, so you don't have to spend so much time setting it up.
I love the machine hip thrusts. Like, what are some of the
Nautilus?
Nautilus, that's what I'm thinking of. Yep.
But the Nautilus, men like it more than women. The women, they
Is
like
that right?
they like the booty builder more, but they also they love the hammer strength, and they love my BC strength one. I just did the hammer strength, but made it the bigger foot plate for shorter women. But yeah, that's very well liked.
Yeah, it's just when you can lock in.
Men
it's
are
so
the
nice.
manufacturers, and when they make them too big.
Yeah,
They don't
yeah.
take into consideration the 5 foot or 4 foot 11 woman that they end up doing like a straight legged bridge on them practically.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, so I do agree with you. They're generally safer than like a lot of the other ones that came before, like an RDL, a barbell back squat, a sumo squat. And so from, again, your lens, top tier, S tier, 100%.
Oh, I didn't say. I'm going A tier. I didn't do an S or
You
an
don't
F.
have an S tier?
I mean, it's just there's so
You
many
gotta
types
put your
of hip
favorite
thrust.
exercise in
I'll put
the
hip
S
thrust.
tier.
I'll put hip thrust S tier
There we go.
because you can do more volume with them. Like on a set per set basis, maybe the walking lunge is even better, but I think you can just do so much more volume, and you end up driving more growth that way. But also, it's just it's an exercise you can do long term. Just don't get carried away at using too much weight and sacrificing lockout mechanics.
So I have a single leg hip thrust in my B tier. And I think that there is certain pros that a bilateral hip thrust can have that a single leg doesn't. So I'm gonna put this in the B tier, but let me explain why. Hip thrust. So with a single leg hip thrust, there is more of a coordinated demand. You can ultimately use less load, and you're going to ultimately struggle to move genuinely through those positions if you're thinking about like the average person doing a single leg hip thrust. With a bilateral hip thrust, you have more opportunity to drive that end range of extension because there's just less things to worry about. And so you can improve terminal hip extension in many cases if you're doing it very well. You're getting those nice foot contacts driving through the ground, because the foot contacts I particularly care about in many cases are the heel, base of the first metatarsal head, base of the fifth metatarsal head, and driving through those and making sure you're putting an emphasis on the first one in particular in the heel without losing the fifth one allows you to really use your glutes effectively and allows you to use them to drive that end range of hip extension. In a single leg hip thrust, I find that it's just harder because of the coordinative demand. However, I'm going to put them on the same tier. I'm going to put the barbell hip thrust on the same tier as the single leg, because while a single leg has more dissociation between sides of the pelvis, and I think that that's nice for people that want to improve rotational capabilities, I think the bilateral one will help you improve overall end range hip extension effectively, just because there's less stuff to think about and you can lock in. The only problem I've seen is when, again, this feeds into the same thing of like an RDL or a barbell back squat, is if you have someone that has a lot of compression on the backside of their body, they tend to revert to more of like a compensatory pattern to deal with that if they're trying to manage around some pain or some sort of like movement dysfunction, especially through end range of hip extension. I find that people have a hard time doing that. So early on, I try not to do a lot of bilateral barbell hip thrust, but as we progress through a program to really, hey, you've got some hip extension range now, let's start to like really ramp that up. That's when I think they slide in really nicely. Let's see what the biggest carryover was. So we both did not like cable pull-throughs. We were both not a big fan of incline treadmill walking. And generally speaking, we had frog pumps relatively low. We had sled pushes low. So those were like our common themes of the lower tiered ones. The higher tiered ones, Bulgarians, we both had very high. We had the glute focused 45 degrees hyper, reverse lunge. We had the step ups, and we also had hip thrusts. Those were the top ones shared between us. So I guess what this is kind of illustrating, at least to me, is that there is a spectrum of, at a certain point, hypertrophy and mobility, they don't get along 100% of the time, because in order to build maximum amounts of muscle, you need to create a lot of tension. And so that's not necessarily the best thing from a mobility and feel good standpoint, but there are exercises, especially like your single leg things where you have more constraints and you can add more of a rotational element. You can still get a ton of glute activation and recruitment without sacrificing those rotational components and that dissociation between sides of the pelvis, the rib cage, all that good stuff, getting good movement through the foot. What are your final thoughts?
Connor, I love hearing your viewpoint on things. Our lens is shaped by the populations we work with. So I always enjoy hearing other people's perspective. I always learn from it and take some things away, and I hope you have also done the same for you. So it's nice to have this video with someone who kind of is from a little slightly different niche within the industry, a more physical therapy related lens, where I'm a more aesthetics driven lens. But we both love movement, and we both are fans and students of movement and biomechanics. So this was great. Thank you for having me on.
Appreciate it, man.